Hello everybody, this is Michael and we arrived at our third lecture, the lecture on global problems. Now, before we get started with the global problems, let us quickly recap what we've said in the last two lectures, because those lectures, well, they gave us the theoretical foundation from which we're going to analyze those problems and possible solutions. So how could in-group cooperation evolve? And I hope you can answer this question in front of your computer. It could evolve by punishing free riding. We've seen it with our social instinct that have been shaped not only to engage in cooperative interaction with one another, but also to protect that cooperation against free riders. And we've seen it with the cultural evolution of our social institutions, which once again did not only coordinate cooperation in those groups, but also, equally important, did protect that cooperation by punishing free riders. The other important question, of course, is why did in-group cooperation evolve? And again, I hope you can answer it quite straightforwardly, because it is very important to distinguish those two questions and to know their answer. So cooperation in groups evolved because it gave individuals in those cooperating groups an edge over other groups. So it evolved in a context of strong group competition, and that, as we said, had important consequences. What does this entail? Well, it entails that it evolved hand in hand with out-group hostility. We've seen it with our social instincts or in-group, out-group bias, that innate tribalism we're all endowed with. But we've also seen it with the way our social structures, social institutions have been shaped by this process of cultural evolution after the agricultural revolution. And we've seen that these institutions, these political structures, well, they did not only enhance cooperation within those groups and maintain cooperation in those groups that massively increased in group size, but they also increased or scaled conflict between groups. Remember the borders, remember what happened with religion, the institutional moralistic religions, but also leading to out-group hostility. All right, so we've arrived at the story about globalization. That's how I ended last lecture. We've seen that for the second time in the history of humankind, we're entering an era in which our society, our social fabric is being radically altered. As you know, the first time this happened was after the agricultural revolution, in which we saw the size of the groups in which we lived massively expand. Now we see that something else is happening. Those groups become interdependent. We're entering the era of globalization. But first, it's useful to think about what exactly globalization is. And this is a term that actually leads to quite a bit of confusion. Often when you read about globalization in newspapers or in books, often it refers to a kind of economic policy, laissez-faire economics, open borders, free markets, but this purely economic way of defining globalization, I think, is wrong. And we'll see that globalization happens across different dimensions. So what is globalization? Well, I would define it as the social, economic, cultural, and political integration of previously independent groups. Importantly, and we briefly addressed this last time, we have to ask ourselves, why is globalization happening? Again, when you read the newspapers, well, you'd have a feeling that globalization is happening because of some kind of political ideology, people wanting to have an open free market on a global scale. But all of these economic policies, as we'll see, are actually a consequence of globalization. The reason globalization is happening has nothing to do with any kind of ideology, political program, but actually it is the product of technology. Just like the agricultural revolution came about because of technological innovations, agricultural technology, globalization is happening because of technological innovations. And these technological innovations, well, they saw the light they emerged in the 19th century and developed throughout the 20th century and are still in full development. And they consist of two different kinds of technologies. Those are transport and communication technologies. Now, in the 19th century, we've seen the birth first of the telegraph, and then later on in the 20th century, the phone would come, the fax machine, and then now we have the internet. And obviously this radically changed the way in which information and communication could travel. Before, information, well, it took a very long time for information to reach far off places. Even in the 19th century wars, Napoleon and France against England, the Battle of Waterloo, it took a whopping 5 or 6 days for that news to reach Paris from Waterloo, England. Now, obviously, it would almost travel in real time. So extremely different kind of context. And because of this because the ability of that information to travel so fast, well, this would radically change the world. Now, the other kind of technologies that radically altered our societies are transport technologies. Now, transport is an interesting thing. We've been traveling on sea for a very long time. So long sea voyages, we've been doing those for like 2,000-3,000 years, perhaps more. But when it came to traveling over land and obviously in the air, the advances in those kind of technologies are very recent. Now, we've invented the wheel a very long time ago, and we quickly learned to have carriages being pulled by animals. But in the 19th century, in the beginning of the 19th century, we were still getting transport by having horse carriages. But then there would be a series of developments which would quickly alter transport. First, you have the steam train, and then you have the cars, and then later in the 20th century, of course, we had airplanes, we had jet engines, and now we can travel in a matter of hours to a different continent. Now, this will radically alter the way in which goods and people can get to other areas of the world. And so nations no longer contain their goods, their people, and their information. And this means that those nations, that those political groups, well, they become more and more interdependent, less and less separate from each other. So technology, more precisely, transport and communication technology, usher us into a new era, the era of globalization. And globalization is happening along different dimensions. So the first dimension of globalization is the one that is best known, and that is economic globalization. Economic actors, well, they operate beyond borders of nations. We import goods, we export goods, we do that on a massive scale. Just look at your wardrobe or all of the things you possess, and chances are that most of those will be at least partly produced in different countries than the ones you're born in or the ones that you live in. We have multinationals. Well, they're active in different countries, they're active on different continents. So the economy is very much globalized in that sense. Moreover, we've seen that national economies are no longer isolated from each other because of the dependence on import and export of goods, but also of capital. We see, for instance, that economic crises, as I've already mentioned in the last lecture, well, that they quickly spread globally. We had this subprime crisis in the US. So mortgage loans that were not being repaid by house owners who couldn't repay those loans. Well, you'd think that would be an American problem and only part of the American economy would be affected, but that wasn't true because those banks got into problems and because other banks in different continents were depending on capital streams from those banks. Well, all of those banks got in problem and even governments in the end got in problem. So there's this huge interdependence of the global economy. We can no longer protect national economies from crises happening in different places in the world. So we've become very, very much interdependent when it comes to the economy. A second important dimension is social globalization. Now there's this story, you could kind of call it an urban legend almost, that is pretty famous and that you may have heard of, and that is that all humans are connected with 6 degrees of interdependence. I think that it came from a playwright that was written somewhere in the 20th century. And that's actually an interesting thought, and people had never thought of kind of trying to figure out if this was true until pretty recently. So the theory would be that you can connect with everybody with every human on this planet by a mere 6 degrees of separation. So you know somebody that would know somebody that would know somebody, etc. If you get 6 of those, you actually can get to anybody. That's an interesting thought experiment. It's very hard to control until recently with social media. And there was this interesting Facebook study. Now there's 2 billion people who have a Facebook account, or at least had at some point. And they wanted to check what the maximal degree of separation between all those Facebook members would be. So not the entire human population, of course, but still, a very sizable piece of that population, 2 billion people. Now, the result, I believe, was that we were connected, that everybody on Facebook was connected with everybody else by maximally 3.75 or, I think 75 degrees of separation. So a very interesting experiment that shows how close and how easily we actually connect, how close we are to everybody else, how easily we connect with everybody else through these technologies. Now, this is obviously something very new, that we can connect with somebody in a different continent with few degrees of separation. Well, obviously, before a European, Columbus in this case, set foot on the American continent, there wasn't any possible number of degrees of separation that would have connected a European with a Native American. And that goes for all of the unexplored continents in the world, of course. But even within Europe, except for, the very small elite, which was somehow connected, like the kings and so forth, people typically were really not easily connected with people in different countries. There was just no travel, no communication between far-off areas in the world. You can also see that in the way, of course, that viruses spread, and this is a very timely topic. When the plague emerged in ancient Europe and in medieval Europe, you could see that the plague was spreading like this ink stain that slowly increased in size. That means that people were only seeing people in neighboring villages, in neighboring cities, but would never undertake large travels, because then they would have infected people in far-off places and there would be different kind of epicentra emerging. Now, as we all know with viruses, we have a virus that emerges in Wuhan, China, and then in a month's time or so, the first cases emerge in different kind of continents. And now it's all over the place, sadly enough. So a very different kind of reality. We travel much more and we're much more closely connected to everybody in the world. This is very much a sign of social globalization. Another important dimension is cultural globalization. Cultural entities we can call those memes. Remember memetics, what we've talked about in last lecture? Well, they invade cultures in which they did not originate. I have this funny story I like to tell about cultural globalization. I was traveling in Senegal in Africa 4 or 5 years ago, and I went to this fisher village and I talked to this fisherman, middle-aged fisherman, and that was actually something that I didn't think much of at the time. It was a great guy and we had fun and an interesting conversation. I don't mean it that way, but it seemed like a normal situation. But then when I reflected on it, it was actually pretty particular, not just in the way that me as a European would be able to travel to Senegal and so forth and meet people in different culture, which by itself already is, but more about that person that I was meeting. Now I was talking to that person in French. Most Senegalese people speak French. And so that's already interesting that an African would speak a European language. That already is a sign of globalization, of course. But that person, he was wearing this soccer shirt, this football shirt from FC Barcelona with Messi on the back. Now that's actually a pretty interesting observation, because wearing soccer attributes, sports attributes, is actually a fashion trend that emerged in the United States in the middle of the 20th century, and that now is something that we do all over the world. So globalized fashion trend there. But even more interesting, I think, the sport that shirt belonged to, football or soccer, well, is a sport that emerged in England. The team that was written on the shirt was FC Barcelona, so a Spanish team with an Argentinian player on the back. So you can see how cultural globalization works, and how all these different kind of cultural entities, memes, be it fashion, be it sports, be it sport activities, and so forth, how all of these spread globally in the last century and a half. And it's amazing how blended all cultures have become as a result. And some, of course, think this is a sad occurrence, and one, you could say, sad way in which this cultural globalization has changed the world is that I think on a yearly basis there are hundreds of languages that extinguish, that nobody is speaking, because there were so many languages. For instance, in New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, they had, for every village had almost a separate language. But now there are these main, more influential languages that just take over. And so many cultural habits and languages and so forth disappear. This is also the result of globalization. And then finally, there's political globalization. Because of this interdependence, and mostly because of that economic interdependence, while groups can no longer pursue an independent policy. If we think about the emergence of global or supranational institutions, think about the UN, but also the EU, the World Bank, the IMF, and so forth. Well, many of those institutions, they try to coordinate policy precisely because economies are no longer interdependent. But also there are other problems like migration, which we've seen in Europe over the last years, which require coordination of different nations. If some nations decide to close off all of their borders, well, that's going to put more pressure on other nations who have to accept the whole stream of migrants and so forth. So there is a need to coordinate policy beyond the borders of independent nations. And this is very much what we mean with political globalization. All right, so let's talk about problems in the global world, in globalia, as I call it here. But before I go into the problems, it's useful to say something about the benefits of globalization. All too often we criticize globalization for a number of different reasons, but we have to realize that this process of globalization, this exchange of goods and information between different nations, well, that it is a massive driver of progress, of economic progress, It has lifted billions of people out of poverty, and it just radically enhances the quality of the lives that we live. Because for a species that is specialized in cooperation, the larger the group that is cooperating, the more or the better the results will be. So the streams of innovations have never been, that stream has never gone as fast as it has today. So we see more and more innovations being introduced, and all of these innovations, of course, lead to better living conditions. But there are also a certain amount of problems in this global context, in this global era, and that is because groups, they do not only exchange information, goods, and people, well, they also exchange their problems, and they do so for two reasons. First of all, as I've already pointed out, well, groups are interdependent, so economic problems will affect other groups than the group in which they originated. Everybody kind of depends on everybody else, so if there's a problem in another group, well, we're seeing the consequences of that. Of course, we've seen something similar with the corona pandemic. If that would have emerged in the Middle Ages, well, we wouldn't have any problem in Europe, obviously. That problem, the pandemic, or it would be an epidemic, would have stayed in Wuhan, probably wouldn't have even affected the whole of China, or it would have taken a very long time to do so. The second reason why problems are also being exchanged in the global era is because of migration. Now, when there's poverty and conflict in certain areas of the world, well, that brings about a stream of mass migration because transport is so available and accessible. Well, people will obviously reliably migrate to areas where there are better living conditions. Therefore, affluent groups are not immune to problems, for instance, in third world countries. And we've probably only seen the beginning of those migration streams. All right, so there's a vicious circle of global problems, which I also describe in the last text you have to read, the one on towards global cooperation, deliberative global citizens assembly. I briefly describe these problems with this kind of frame as well, so you can also read up on it there. And I won't take too much time in explaining all of these links. I think most of you will be aware of these links. But quickly, perhaps, I'd like to say something about these different problems, which I think are thoroughly global problems, meaning that we can only solve them by coordinating policy on a global level. Well, two of those problems are not new. In fact, two of those problems have been companions of humankind for all of human history, and we've made enormous progress when it comes to those problems. And those problems are poverty and conflict. In the beginning of the 20th century, more than 90% of the world population lived under the poverty threshold, lived on, I think it is, €1 or less per day, and that is obviously purchasing power, because there weren't any euros around and it wouldn't make sense to kind of try to convert it to the money that was around back then. But so more than 90% of the world population lived in very, very basic conditions and would always die of starvation when there was some kind of crop failure, when there was bad harvest and so forth. So that was the condition for most of humankind for almost all of our history. In that last century, we've made enormous progress. In the 1980s, beginning of 1980s, still more than 40% were living in extreme poverty. And today, I think we're at 7-8%, although the world population has exploded in that time. So we've made amazing progress, and it's important to emphasize that. Secondly, conflict is something that has been a part and parcel of human history as well. I've already touched upon that. And again, we've made amazing progress there. After the Second World War, we've entered an area that is so peaceful that we cannot compare it with any other era in the history of humankind. the chances of you dying by the hand of somebody else in some kind of armed conflict, be that people sent by the states or just, criminals and so forth, well, they're actually 50 times smaller, and that is for the world population. It's much more if you consider Europe by itself, for instance. But okay, for the world population, it's 50 times smaller than in the Middle Ages and 500 times smaller probably than before the agricultural revolution, where there were small raids in between tribes and groups very frequently. So we've made amazing progress on these extremely important problems. But they are still there, and now they've acquired a global characteristic, and I'll explain why. So let me briefly say something about the vicious circle here. So first of all, we have climate change, I believe the most pressing challenge of our time. Now, climate change, well, it threatens to put people in extreme poverty. I think the climate scientist Norman Myers estimates that if the climate rises more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, and we're definitely headed towards that, we could be there before 2050, well, there will be a whopping 200 million people who will have to migrate because of droughts and floods and islands flooding and so forth. So because they can no longer survive on where they live now. And so this obviously will put them in extreme poverty, will lead them to migrate to other areas. Now, migration can be a major problem because it can profoundly destabilize societies, at least that is when there is mass migration. We've already seen the problems that migration from Syria, because of the civil war there, has created in European societies, but more importantly in the neighboring societies of Jordan, of Turkey, and so forth. Now, migration so leads to conflict, but conflict obviously is one of the primary drivers of migration. When there is a war, something, as I said in the Syrian example, well, people will obviously migrate. So they call that the conflict trap in a certain way. And there's also a conflict trap with poverty, because in poor nations, the likelihood of conflict erupting is much larger than in more affluent nations. People have much less to lose, and they have to fight for their survival. But obviously, as we know, well, conflict, war is one of the great destroyers of any kind of value in a society. Human capital, but also other economic processes are profoundly disturbed. So conflict does obviously lead to poverty. Then poverty, well, it also leads to overpopulation in the modern era. That didn't used to be the case, but now we see that overpopulation is happening in the most poor regions of the world. Whenever you give people better outlook in life, better means of living, well, somehow they reproduce less, and that seems to be there seems to be a very strong correlation between the wealth in a society and the reproductive rate of people in that society. So it's a reverse correlation. And then overpopulation, well, in turn will also lead and does lead to migration, because there's too many people in a certain area, and in turn could also feed into climate change, could exacerbate climate change. As of now, climate change, it is important to say, is mainly, perhaps almost exclusively, the consequence of rich nations and the energy consumption in rich nations. But as the world acquires more wealth, well, obviously overpopulation is going to be a major problem. If many people are consuming much energy, and that energy comes from fossil fuels, well, then we have a major problem, and climate change is exacerbated. And so we have this kind of vicious circle that we must break in a global context, because those problems, well, they not only affect people globally, but they can only be solved on a global level. If you want to solve climate change, well, it is very obvious that we need to curb CO2 emission and the emission of other greenhouse gases on a global level. It doesn't matter if one country is doing a great job in curbing, one small country is doing a great job in curbing those emissions. If the rest of the world continues polluting, well, that's not going to change much. So there needs to be global policy in reducing CO2 and methane gas emission. That's the first one. Poverty, well, that's actually also a thoroughly global problem. As I'm going to tell you in the next slides, I believe, well, poverty can and will be solved probably because of global coordination and global cooperation. There's enough funds in the world to eradicate poverty, but what misses is coordination of a good policy to do so. So, and I've already said a few words about that. How are we to break this vicious circle? Well, I think we must start at the source of this vicious circle, and we must do everything we possibly can to solve climate change and to eradicate poverty. And these are very much global cooperation problems. Now, climate change is a global tragedy of the commons. Remember Hardin's tragedy of the commons? There's 10 shepherds, they each have 10 sheep. There's a pasture that can sustain 100 sheep, but every shepherd is going to be tempted to add another sheep to his flock, get more revenue, but at the end, the common resource, the pasture, will turn into a wasteland and the whole community will suffer the consequences. Something similar is the case with climate change. Now, all nations, all people on Earth have a very strong interest. It's in their interest to curb CO2 emissions and to prevent climate change from causing massive problems in the coming decades, centuries. But they have a short-term incentive to keep producing as much as possible and not investing in technological innovations to foster green energy. All of that costs money now. And so there's this short-term incentive to keep polluting and destroy the common resource that is our environment, and that is the climate. Now, poverty is not so much a tragedy of the commons as a global coordination problems. We do have the financial means to eradicate poverty today, but we lack the global coordination to do so efficiently. In fact, it has been calculated that the amount of funds that are being donated on a yearly basis, either by nations or by individual people, well, radically, it is almost double of the funds we would need to eradicate poverty if we were to have a very efficient policy coordinated on a global level in doing so. Now, poverty eradication is something that requires a good policy, and that is very clear from one of the most successful poverty reducing policies in history, and that is the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. Now, the Marshall Plan instigated by the US in order to get Europe, the whole of Europe, back on its feet after the Second World War, was a massive success, and it managed to get the European economy up and going in a number of years after the Second World War. In 10 years, Europe was again a thriving economy, or had many thriving economies. Now, the success of this Marshall Plan was its coordination. What happens today with global poverty is all nations have different kind of policies. You have USAID doing some stuff, then you have the Europeans doing some stuff, you have China doing completely different stuff. So everybody has its own projects and none of that is coordinated. And this utter lack of coordination is why it is not so efficient. So there's a huge amount of money that is being donated in some sense or another in order to eradicate poverty, but it fails to do so not because we're not donating enough, but because it lacks a coordinated policy. And this has not escaped the analysts, and there have been many articles written about it. There has been a summit in the United Nations, I think it was in 2015 as well, in which they attempted to come to a better global policy for eradicating poverty. But so far, national interests and differences between nations have not permitted to do so. So everybody keeps doing whatever he thinks is the best, and that is a major problem. And the same goes for our current predicament, the corona crisis. It is, I believe, very much a global coordination problem. In order to overcome this pandemic, well, we first had to pool resources to exchange information on how to contain the virus, to develop medicines, treatments, and then ultimately these vaccines. We also had to coordinate all kinds of preventative measures to control the spread of the virus. And now we face the important and vital task to roll out these vaccines globally. We must do so out of solidarity, but also out of self-interest, because if we let the pandemic run wild in other, let's say, less developed countries with less access to these vaccines, well, variations are bound to spring up, re-enter countries that have a high degree of vaccination, but those vaccines will not protect perhaps against these new variants. So we must now proceed in a very concerted global effort to ramp up the production of these vaccines and roll them out globally. That is our major task or the major strategy to defeat this pandemic. And then when the health crisis is behind us, we must coordinate our economic policy, global economic policy, to lift the world out of this very deep recession that has followed from the pandemic. Now, we can only hope that such an acute and shared global crisis can foster feelings of global solidarity. And we've seen some of that. We've seen it especially in the scientific community, in which there was a global effort in order to, as I said, spread information about the virus, about possible strategies to develop vaccines, and this has enabled us to produce these working vaccines in a record time. But we can never underestimate human nature, especially human tribalism. And we've also seen these tribalistic tendencies spring up during this crisis. At the beginning, we've seen nations pointing accusing fingers towards one another. Then we've seen hoarding of essential products in a society, of treatments, medicines, and so forth. And then finally now, and most importantly, we see hoarding of the vaccines, and we see that less developed countries with no big pharma companies within their borders, well, they do not have access, or at least a very limited access only, to these working vaccines. And that, as I said, is problematic. And therefore, we can only hope that we'll defeat our tribalistic tendencies, and that this shared crisis will enable us to all come together, cooperate globally in a concerted effort to turn this rather black page of the corona pandemic. And so the question we will ask ourselves in the next lecture and during the seminar is, how can we cooperate globally? How can we cooperate globally in the face of our current crisis, but also in the face of this vicious circle and this major problem of climate change that will still be there once we have dealt with the corona crisis? And I believe this is the major challenge of our time. We've entered this new era, the global era, and it comes with this major challenge to cooperate on a global scale in order to address our most pressing problems. And we must realize that there are two major obstacles to global cooperation. And I hope you kind of know what I'm going to say now because it really follows from the last two lectures. The two obstacles here are, first of all, our social nature or social instincts or innate tribalism. And then secondly, those social institutions, those political structures which cement groups, which coordinate cooperation in different groups differently, and so make it harder to coordinate policy on a global scale, and which sometimes also promote out-group hostility. So in the face of these major obstacles, how can we overcome this and how can we get towards efficient and durable global cooperation? That is, I believe, the question we have to ask ourselves, and that is the question we'll ask ourselves in the coming lecture. As Ban Ki-moon, the former UN secretary, famously said, "We are the first generation that can end poverty and the last that can fight climate change. We have a duty to act."